This is the third and last part of the Polymer Clay Basics tutorial. I will be covering the different tools I use, blending clay, and doing some real-time demonstrations. So here are all my main tools. I have more, but I never use them, so you can see you don't need a lot to get started. And if you can't afford to get too many tools, remember you can always make them out of Sculpey. They won't last as long, but that is one option. Now, first, this isn't for sculpting, but it's very useful to have a set of needle nose pliers for shaping your armatures, and if they can double as wire cutters, even better. Next, an X-Acto knife is one of my few must-haves and is useful for all sorts of stuff, from cutting away clay without disturbing anything else, to blending raw clay into dry clay and getting into tight corners. It's not so good for larger cuts though, so it's also nice to have one of these types with the longer snap-off blades. My only other real must-have tool is this one with the tiny round ends. It's called a ball stylus and it's essential for blending. The one I have is about 2 millimeters on one end and 1 millimeter on the other. They come in different sizes, but I have just this one. Whenever I need anything bigger, I usually want something quite a lot bigger, so I use this homemade tool, which is just a sewing pin with a Sculpey handle. If you find a pin small enough, you could probably make a small one as well, though. Next, I have a few of these types with wire loops, but I rarely use them. One is more than enough. I usually shape with my fingers and carve with the X-Acto knife because these tend to sort of drag on the clay. Now, these following tools I got in a set a long time ago. I can't remember from where, but these are wax carving tools. They tend to come in sets, but more isn't always better. These came in a 20-piece set, but half of the end shapes repeated, and they weren't even stainless steel. I only really ended up using the following few. This one is the one I use to make hair. It just works. The curve where it bends is smooth and tapers kind of like a clothing iron. I drag it along locks of hair to push them in and divide them to give them some depth. More on that in the real-time demo at the end. Then this is kind of a longer version with a smoother tip. I also occasionally use it for hair, but mainly I use it for attaching eyes instead of using the round tool, which distorts the area around it in such a tight spot. It's also really nice for shaping lips. Then this one I think of as a larger version of the previous one, but without the bend. Again, useful for attaching eyes and widening openings like the mouth. Last is this one with a curved, sharp tip. It looks strange, but comes in handy occasionally with curved areas, like when you're pushing the corners of the eyes in and shaping those. Then there's these two, which are pretty similar, kind of spoon-like. I don't use them as much, but they can be nice for pushing in an area smoothly, like the eyes, or creating a curved fold, like for the sides of the nose. And then I also use these dentist picks. A similar shape tends to come in wax carving tool sets, but mine didn't have any, so I use these, or sometimes when I can't find them, depending on the level of detail. I've also used anything from regular sewing needles to larger blunt sewing needles. And I use these for getting to tight spots and also poking out the pupil of the eye when my ball stylus tool is too large. And that's it. I do very occasionally experiment with the other shapes, but I always come back to these. What are essential if you want to get any type of smooth finish are brushes. Medium hard to hard synthetics work best. You can use larger, rougher brushes during the blocking out phase because they tend to move and remove more clay, then move on to softer ones for more sensitive, detailed areas. Don't use expensive brushes though. The clay is very rough on them, so try to get a few cheap ones just for sculpting. You can also use rougher bristle brushes to add some textures like skin pores. Last, I just want to mention calipers. They can be nice for measuring but aren't necessary. You can use the tool you're sculpting with instead to measure in the same way you might pencil when drawing. But even if you measured correctly, this doesn't always guarantee your sculpt will come out right. You should of course be rotating the sculpt around and checking it from every side, But apart from that, turning it upside down can also help, or viewing it in a mirror to flip it like you would a drawing. I've also found changing the direction of your light source every once in a while can help spot irregularities. And then, last but not least, your fingers are one of the best tools. They are great at feeling out irregularities and depth that are hard to catch with your eyes or measuring tools. You can see here how I realized after cooking this that the jaw was too thick and started to carve away at it, feeling every once in a while to check it was the right depth, something I couldn't quite tell by just looking. Now, there are two types of blending, raw on raw and raw on baked. As I mentioned in the other part, I don't like working raw on raw too much. The only tip I can give you is to not try to attach things by pushing them into the clay, as this will distort the surrounding areas. Instead, try to attach any extra pieces of clay by the edges. This is where the ball stylus tool really shines. I use it to push in the edges of a piece, always being as gentle as possible. Sometimes, like with the eyes though, this isn't really possible and I use other tools as I will show, but when adding over mostly flat areas, this is what I do. Now, once a blended area is as smooth as I can get it with the tool, if it's possible to use my fingers to smooth it further, I will. Otherwise, I use a brush and rub it across the surface. The harder the brush, again, the more it will smooth, but also the more likely it is to disturb surrounding clay. So start with a soft brush and use a harder one only as needed. Then come back to a soft brush to smooth out any texture. Now, you might still get an overall rough look, just ignore it for now. Before cooking your piece, you can further smooth out any leftover roughness by adding some softener to the brush and repeating this where necessary. Some people also use alcohol, and in that case, the higher the percentage, the more it smooths. This shouldn't cause any ill effects, but it should not be used to actually try to soften the clay with. Anyways, don't worry that the center isn't really properly attached, even if it does break off after baking. It's better to just reattach the piece later if it happens to break off, instead of ruining your sculpt from pressing too hard. Also, by not pushing too hard, when you make a mistake, it's easier to peel off pieces you attached like this and start over. The only exception I make to attaching pieces like this is when I make noses. I always try to form those from clay that's already there because it looks much better than attaching it. You just have to make sure to start out faces with more clay than needed, so you have enough to work with. Now, raw and baked is a lot easier to work with in my opinion, but it's also much harder to attach clay to the baked clay initially. Pushing it in really hard usually does the trick, but if that doesn't, the first thing I would try is adding a bit of softener to the clay you're trying to attach, as that will make it stickier. If that doesn't work, then you can try adding some texture with rough sandpaper. Just be sure to wipe off any residue. Or you can try scoring the surface with the X-Acto knife. Now, to smooth the edges and also to help the clay attach, I usually also scrape it like this with the X-Acto knife, then smooth it with my fingers. You can then build on top of this like you would raw on raw. And I overcooked this piece so that the difference was clearer on camera, but even if you bake in layers, so long as you don't overcook them, once you cooked this new clay, you wouldn't be able to see the seam. If you're interested in ramp baking, by the way, I would recommend saving that until the very last layer and cooking or even undercooking all the other ones a bit. And now for the real-time demos. So this is how I do the hair. For smaller pieces, I usually work in one large chunk, but this doesn't work well with larger pieces, so I roll up strands like this. Usually I'm working on baked clay, but you can see how you might use a different tool to secure the sides of the clay onto raw clay. Now, once it's attached, I start to push and shape the clay into a strand. The piece I used is a lot bigger than the actual hair strands should be. This is on purpose so that I can then start to divide it. You can see the clay might break up sometimes. It's fine, just smooth it back together. You can then further divide the strand to add even more depth and detail. Then, once I've done as much as I can with that tool, I switch to that longer tool I talked about to fix any uneven areas and add the texture of individual hairs and blend them a bit into the surrounding area. Also, I'd like to mention I find it easiest to work from back to front, so from the nape of the neck to the front top of the head, as this helps the hair strands stack one on top of each other. So that was the hair, and now I'm going to do a quick eye. Again, you can see how I used the other tool to push the clay into the surrounding area. If I use the ball stylus tool, it messes up the area around the brow and nose and makes it too large. This tool, on the other hand, allows me to push the clay in as if it's a fold of skin. Once the general shape is there, I use this tool to shape the lids while at the same time giving the eye the roundness it needs. I then flatten and shape the eyelids a bit with this and other tools. Once that's shaped, I'll add the tear duct area with the ball stylus, and I might blend any rough edges like this, then fix the weird overlap around the middle of the skin caused by the tool when I rounded the eye. I left the bottom lid unfixed, so hopefully you can see the difference. Usually I will also blend the bottom lid into the cheek with the ball stylus, but that's easy to do compared to making the eye bulge out like this. To smooth the leftover roughness you get from doing it this way while keeping the look of the skin fold, I use the brush to smooth things out. And now for the eyeball, I get a small flattened sphere, position it and flatten it like so. Then secure the edges with the small ball stylus. This looks weird, but what I then do is cut that bulging part with the X-Acto knife. I flatten that a bit, then at the end I poke out the pupil with the appropriately sized tool. Sometimes the ball stylus will do, other times I will use the dentist pick, and either before or after, like here, I will smooth and round the surrounding area. This was just a quick demo, but usually I will then take my time fixing any areas that look rough and uneven. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and don't be discouraged if things take you a few tries. The great thing about polymer clay is that you can always start over, so just keep at it. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Otherwise, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. And if you're interested in seeing what I'm up to ahead of time, you can follow me on Facebook or Instagram. I post my sketches and works in progress there. And then recently, I also made a Twitter so I can also share any interesting things I find from other artists to art-related articles and tutorials. Lastly, I want to take the chance to thank my first Patreon for supporting me. I redid the rewards recently so that you can get everything under the $1 tier. So if you want to help support me, take advantage of that while it lasts. You can also follow me there even if you're not a Patreon, and you'll be notified about anything I post.